We have a few short minutes here, about 40 or 45, to bring some other perspectives on the table. So I'm going to just launch right in here and briefly introduce our panelists. Their full bios are in your packets. To my far right, I can't see her, but I know she's there, is Mary Sully Luque. Mary is at Thunderbird, the kind of quintessential international management business school in the U.S. I've known Mary for some time. Among other things, she was very engaged in something called Project Globe, which is an initiative that Bob House at Wharton began many years ago, and it's had quite a profound impact on our field, and I'm going to get back to Project Globe in a little bit. In the middle here is Terry Sanz. I don't know Terry, but I've heard great things about him from Alan. He's with obviously a very important institution here in Boston, and really a global financial institution. He's currently Senior Vice President and CFO of the Shared Services Unit at Fidelity. Those of you from abroad who don't know Fidelity, it's one of the largest mutual fund managers in the U.S. and in the world. I happen to be 10 miles down the road from Vanguard, one of their principal competitors. I didn't tell Terry that. He won't hold it against me, I hope. To my immediate left is Nikos Passas. Nikos is a law professor, but also is very engaged in the practice of law with numerous international organizations, public and private. Again, you can read more about his background in the packet. So our plan of action here is that I have a couple questions I'm going to throw at the panel. I have some that are individual, some that are collective, but we hope to have at least 10 or 15 minutes to continue the discussion now once we have heard some of their views. So let me launch right in. Terry, let me start with you. Could you briefly describe from kind of your practitioner viewpoint and perspective what you see as the essential elements of responsible global leadership, as opposed to, as Mark laid out, responsible leadership on the one hand and global leadership on the other? How do those two things come together in the world of Fidelity?
Well, thanks. As the only one on the panel without his own book, I thought I would really talk about some of the elements of how these need to be operationalized. And I'll focus on three. One, have a plan. Individual leaders and managers are going to be held accountable to the usual assortment of financial and operational metrics. That isn't an option. That accountability is going to exist. Broadening that series of accountability to include stakeholders and or other value outcomes that are going to be prioritized is critical. Otherwise, all you really do have is the normal operating business and a well-wishing approach to getting something done. Economic scarcity is going to force you to pick your shots so that you really cannot approach all of these outcomes or other shareholders, stakeholders at the same time. Second, anticipate trade-offs. They're going to happen, especially in a global arena where you're going to have differences of social, cultural, and regulatory nature across different countries and managers. How you handle the trade-offs is going to be a function of how open a set of communications you have between what is viewed as a headquarters or home country, as well as other countries, and hierarchically levels of management. How safe is it for someone at a lower level of management to bring forward what is going to be an unpopular decision or one that doesn't have a great net present value outcome associated with it? What type of culture do you put in place to inform people of what their true decision rights are? Because corporations are not democracies. Ultimately, one person has to make the call. And how do you make people feel they're engaged in that call? And then lastly, engagement. A lot of the leadership material you'd see at Fidelity starts with the phrase ensures availability of resources, financial and otherwise. That doesn't mean arm wrestling over the annual budget. It means that as a leader, you have the right capabilities, whether they be marketing capabilities, economic capabilities, manufacturing capabilities, in place on a full-time or a part-time basis. You may need virtual teams to do that. You need money. And back to number one with the plan, if you've identified an outcome you want and it has no money associated with it, good luck.
Thank you, Terry. Very illuminating. Nikos, you have been involved in various international negotiations and agreements and arbitration across nationalities and cultures and socioeconomic classes. What are some of the intense challenges that occur in those settings? And are there instances of responsible leaders who are able to bring these disparate, sometimes conflicting parties together in a positive way? And do you have an example that you might share with us in that regard?
I don't have a single one. There are multiple. It's very hard to just identify one. Just by way of background, I drafted the legislative guides for the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption and some other instruments. My task was to explain without interpreting, because every word was negotiated to bits. So I had to sit down with a very good sample of anti-corruption leaders who negotiated those treaties. So I got to know them well. I got to see them in action afterwards. And some of them have become very close friends. So I can't take them apart. But I can tell you that the Attorney General of Qatar, for example, dared go after a member of the royal family. That is an example of responsible leadership. I was in the room where the minister from Brazil made the decision to go after the sports minister recently in Brazil, and I could see the effect on the vice minister and the senior team that were in the room, and it was a memorable evening because we ended up with very good red wine.
Maybe to smooth some of the tensions over that had been generated.
They needed it.
Yeah.
I have seen how the number two, the right-hand man of the Attorney General in China, can see the limits of what can be done in the Beijing context and how that can translate into international initiatives. So some of the elements that I can see there were reflected by the top that I would pick from here, and that is the United Nations. That was the godmother, the godfather of the UN Convention. They brought the interests together. They knew substantive knowledge, patience, appreciation of the context, of contextual acting, picking the right stakeholders from the various ones in order to engage effectively with them, and listening. I mean, anyone who has a teenager and in your household knows the drill when you speak to the teenager and there's no response, and after you insist, you get an honest answer. Dad, I'm hearing, I'm not listening. So it is very frustrating when that happens. That can happen to organizations, that can happen to industry sectors, that can happen to countries. So listening is actually key to getting things done at the international level.
Very helpful, Nikos. I'm going to go down to Mary now. I mentioned earlier Project Globe. How many of you are familiar with Project Globe? So at least half of you. I think it's hard to underestimate the profound impact that Project Globe has had on the field of international management and even more broadly, industrial organization psychology and whatnot. Those of you who aren't familiar with it, I encourage you to go on one of the various websites and learn more about it, the multiple books and awards and whatnot. But one of the things about Project Globe that I've found, and I mentioned this to Mary during the break, is that it seems complex for the uninitiated. And I wonder, Mary, if you might help this group distill a couple of the practical takeaways that we can draw from what is an incredible research exercise, but sometimes is hard to kind of disentangle, especially implications for the topic that we have here at hand, responsible global leadership.
Yeah, I'll just do just a quick overview of Project Globe. GLOBE stands for Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness, and a lot of you are familiar with it, but some may not be. And it was started by Professor Bob House at Wharton, who is my mentor, in 1993. And it's a multi-year, multi-phase study of leadership and culture around the world. The first phase was developing the actual measures, trying to figure out what culture and leadership were, using focus groups, interviews, archival data, existing studies, very much influenced by Hofstede study, if you've heard of the Hofstede dimensions. That played a great role in influencing them, and some of the dimensions are actually quite similar, but some are very different. So that was the first phase, developing the measures. Second phase was actually going into organizations, developing questionnaire surveys, going into organizations in 62 countries and surveying middle managers in 3 different industries: financial services, food processing, and telecommunications in 62 societies, and surveying middle managers, because middle managers are leaders of someone, but also have someone leading them. So getting their perspective on what they looked for in leaders. And from that became our first book, which was published in 2004. So starting in 93, publishing in 2004, working with over 150 scholars from around the world who actually did the gathering of the data. 900 organizations, 17,000 middle managers. And that was, we figured out what people said they looked for in leaders, and also how they described their cultures. And it's complex because there's 9 dimensions of culture, and there's 6 dimensions of leadership, but actually 21 first order dimensions, and then a second order, six broadly, we call them global dimensions. And then what you could do is see how the people varied on culture and also on leadership. And we found that there were differences on what people looked for. There were some universal aspects, and there were, for instance, visionary. Vision is a really important predictor of effectiveness. It's what people look for, and then in our third phase, which I'll tell you about in a second, it's what the leaders actually do. Vision is very important, as is integrity and inspiration. So anyway, we found what people said they looked for in leaders. And then in the third phase, which is the book that I've been working on since I started at Wharton in 2000 as a senior fellow, and the book is actually coming out at the end of this week. It'll be at the, which is and it's all really the brainchild of Bob House from Wharton, who died in November of 11, and great man. He took those dimensions of leadership. We looked at culture dimensions, but we didn't measure culture in this. This was all about leadership. He took the dimensions of leadership, developed questionnaire items out of those. We went into 24 countries. We surveyed CEOs. Well, we interviewed CEOs, did some surveying of CEOs, but the top management team. So we're looking at strategic leadership. And so we looked at we were trying to test what people said they identified as what they looked for in leaders. How did that actually play out in the organization when you have leaders? Did that lead to effectiveness or performance? So what people said they looked for, did that actually lead to organizational performance, firm performance? And we found there were some universal, there were some universal indicators of successful leaders. We had 40 CEOs and at least 6 of their top management team in 24 countries. So in the end, we had over 1,000 CEOs and over 7,000 top management team reporting in this survey in 24 countries. So what we found was that charismatic leadership and team orientation, 2 of our global indicators, and charismatic leadership were some of the dimensions of that are visionary, being performance-oriented, decisive, inspirational, having integrity. Those are very much associated with firm performance, with both internal indicators, so that would be top management team performance, as well as sales and industry dominance. So that we had some external performance measures. So, and we found that because I can't go into all of this, and I know that I'm going over my time, but being participative was also very important, but not as important, not as high as the visionary and inspirational. One thing that we did find that was, I thought, kind of interesting was that being administratively competent was very much associated with firm performance. So, there's this debate whether being a good manager, do leaders need to be good managers as well? And what we found is, yeah, they do. So you need to, that is associated with firm performance. And anyway, the kind of the takeaway from that is that there were some things that were associated, we did find were associated. And so we took from the 24 countries, actually we had a crossover of 18 that were in reported in the first book. And we looked to see what people said they looked for in the leaders, and what the leaders actually did in the countries, did they match? And largely we found they did. So what people said they looked for in their leaders in their countries, and that could differ from country to country, is largely what people did in those countries, what the leaders actually did, the CEOs, except in Russia. which is so what people say they look for in Russia. This is what we found. I mean, it's close, but it's the most different of all the countries. What people say they look for in Russia is a lot like Vladimir Putin in some ways. That profile is kind of the profile that they look for. But if you want to be an effective CEO, then you're not going to look exactly like that. We found that there were differences, which was kind of interesting, and we found a little bit of variation in some of the other countries, but they were mostly closely aligned. So the bottom line, if you want to, this has been a couple of decades worth of research that we have, but we did find that there are, you do need to understand what those profiles of leaders look like in the countries you're going into, and they may be a bit different than the country that you are operating in. So your expectations of leaders might be a little bit different than in some of the countries that you're going into, and being aware of that is really important, especially when we're talking about responsible leadership.
Thanks, Mary. Obviously, you should buy the book. I'm going to come back to Nikos and maybe use what Mary did not focus on in the Globe Project, and it's maybe not one of the more important elements, but that is where practices and aspirations diverge. So where people are looking for a certain type of culture or practice, but what they're finding is something different. And when we see those situations, some people view that circumstance as one that it leads to things like corruption, So people would like things to be a certain way, but they operate in the way that they are. And so, Nikos, you mentioned earlier that you've been involved in various corruption codes and initiatives. And, you know, when I look around the world and I look at the Transparency International rankings, and Sheila Puffer's here, and she's the real expert, and look at some of the international agreements like the OECD convention, it's easy to get a little frustrated and disappointed because, you know, it seems like you open the newspaper every day and there's yet another corruption scandal. I wonder if, in addition to what you mentioned earlier, if there are instances we can point to where leaders stepped forward and really did begin to do something tangible about corruption that would give us more inspiration than at least I'm seeing as I look at the playing field.
Well, one quick point to start with is that when we hear about corruption, you can interpret it two ways. One is that corruption is going up. Two is that we're doing something about it. And it's a very tough one because you can't tell. But the bottom line is that the more you act on corruption and the more cases you bring, the more newspapers will write about it, and the perceptions will be that the problem is growing when it is exactly the time it's being addressed. So caution on how we interpret these things, especially with TI's perception index. Secondly, the OECD is very much, in some ways at least, a globalization of FCPA. The UN Convention Against Corruption is a much more comprehensive, consensus-based, very broad instrument that, the prevention chapter in that convention is a blueprint for good governance, private and public sector as well. And it has inspired countries. A lot of countries resisted international instruments because they were not their priorities. And they had other problems. They didn't have problems with money laundering or terrorism. They had problems with poverty and environment and education and poverty. With corruption, it's different. It is actually a new bridge between the North and the South because of one chapter that introduces the fundamental principle of return, the repatriation of stolen assets. The Third World wants its money back. But in order to get it back, it requires all the legal and institutional infrastructure that it takes to implement also the other instruments. So here we have a convergence. In this context, we have seen countries like Georgia or the Philippines or Brazil engage in real reforms. Georgia is a good example because you can see how they rejected also the cottage industry of consultants. I'm one of them, so I can say that. And they developed a homegrown solution to how you reorganize the procurement program. In Brazil, they have made it totally open. They have the transparency portal that has become a leading example in the world on how you put everything online and citizens have access to it. And in the Philippines, you can see how you are starting from a context where everything is steeped in corruption, and you don't know where to start, and you come up with a strategy, and you involve the different stakeholders, and you involve civil society, and you involve the corporations and the private sector, and you engage them little by little to make huge differences. So take a look at the Philippines as one of those leading examples. But I would like to tie this question with what we were talking about earlier and your point about marrying the different competing interests. And I will pick a controversial case, BCCI, Bank of Credit and Commerce International. That was a global scandal that broke out in '91, for those that remember. And it was presented to the world as a corrupt culture, organizational culture. Well, I've studied BCCI for 11 years, and I can tell you that we've thrown out the baby together with the bathwater. 3 examples of some of the controversies that got lost here. The first one, the inspiration, the leader of BCCI, the founder and CEO, Aga Hassan Abedi, was a visionary who energized, empowered, and delegated in his organization that operated in dozens of countries, right? One of the things that he did was he said, we are for profit, we're private, we're for profit, but we're not maximizing profit. We're going to operate in countries where we're making loss because we need to do good and because we need to return things to society. We're going to make this up in countries over time and in countries where we are very profitable. So feel good about doing this. Now, this was interpreted at the time, early 90s, as cultic. And well, what is this guy talking about? A second example, he was giving at the end of the year money to each employee at BCCI to give to their charity of their choice. And somebody said, what if they keep it? And his answer was, well, if they keep it, they need it. And the third example is a legal breach. This was the time, the 80s, where the IMF was imposing all kinds of conditionalities on loans. BCCI was an instrument for avoiding those conditionalities and was lending itself as a way to park foreign reserves for countries. Now, history looks back and looks and considers the IMF policies as catastrophic and wrong. And then you have to take a look at BCCI that was actually acting together with third world leaders in the South, trying to get them out and help in that process millions of communities and livelihoods. So these are some of the things that get lost when we just take money laundering and bribery and say this is all that this institution did.
Terry, obviously the financial services industry overall, as Nikos points out, has been one of those under the closest scrutiny in the last decade when it comes to issues of not just corruption, but ethics and governance and insider trading and everything else. And we saw earlier in the first presentation that among the least trusted industries, sorry to say, banking and finance seems to be the worst or among the worst. What are some of the things that the industry overall and Fidelity in particular have done to try to kind of work in a more positive direction with regard to this broad area of ethics, governance, and corruption?
Yeah, so I'd say 3 things. One, because the industry is, as Fidelity, highly regulated to begin with, the programs are really centered and grounded in a compliance mentality. Here are the rules, follow the rules, dot the I's, which leaves out the over half of the potential actions that you could take. So I think as compliance evolves towards ethics, you actually see positively differentiating activities and actions working their way into the system. In this space at Fidelity, our senior-most person is titled Global Anti-Corruption Officer. She is an attorney, she is out of the compliance side, and she is laser focused on all of the non-compliance activities that we're doing, including really the second area, a risk-based approach to how we operate in countries. One size does not fit all. You really do need to evaluate the inherent risks associated with operating in different countries, whether it be Russia, China, India, etc. They're going to be different. And that drives different amount of oversight, it drives different amount of monitoring, and it drives different amount of training. And the minutia can kill you. As part of the risk-based awareness, we created a series of parameters, operating metrics for which local managers would be judged on a global standard. We thought there was really nothing groundbreaking about this. This was standard across financial services and any of our competitors would have similar metrics on different letterhead paper. So it's your typical stoplight metrics. Green is good, yellow is you gotta look at it, red flags are bad. So we indoctrinated people that red flags were a bad thing, that this was a situation you really didn't want to have happen. And then we opened up our new software development company in Dalian, China. You know, that country with the big red flag and the yellow stars on it. And we did confuse people on the ground who read and saw the online material about red flags being really a bad thing.
Now this is going to be written up in every business book, and we're going to. So I hope you don't mind. We're going to use this as a cross-cultural foible.
Did I say it was from Vanguard? Vanguard.
We're gonna replace that old Chevy Nova example. We've got a better one now, more contemporary.
So what we did is, we had two sets of activities happen. One was an affinity group in the U.S. So senior leaders, managers of Asian American descent, Chinese descent, to say, help us understand the context that we're going to be in, because the content really isn't that groundbreaking. We then said online training in this environment is going to be a mistake. So all training is going to be on the ground with sufficient opportunity for us to have an interactive dialogue about what was wrong. So the good news is once we got through the barrier, we had no red flags. So this was going to be a moot situation. But the way it was delivered really emphasized some of the cross-cultural differences and the need to create an open environment in which to start that trust building.
Terry, thank you. Mary, your business school, the Thunderbird American Graduate School of International Management, has been kind of at the vanguard in terms of global leadership training. And a lot of work you do is in executive education, either for individual companies or open enrollment. And I wonder if in that work, both studying those organizations but also working with them, you can extract any lessons or models of kind of really best practices among firms that are seeking to do what Fidelity ultimately did, which is to develop some globally standardized, I guess, approaches, but that are also locally adaptive.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I could probably spend a lot of time talking about that.
No, you used up a lot of it with your last
I know, that's
answer, so
why,
you've only got a little. I've
that
got to
was
warn
the
you.
rest
It's part
of
my job.
That's what I was going to say. So, what I'm going to tell you is some work we had done on one of the studies I was involved in, and we looked at corporate social responsibility and some of the dimensions of culture, to seeing if any dimensions of culture actually inhibited CSR activities. And what we found was we looked at in-group collectivism, and in-group collectivism is how a society identifies with their in-group, their family, their tribe, their caste, their class. A lot of societies in the world are higher on in-group. In the United States, we're not as high. Another dimension we looked at of collectivism is called societal collectivism, and that's how you identify at the societal level. Do you identify like at the institutional level? And in the U.S., we're a little bit higher on that. So when you start to talk about that which is American, people from the U.S. kind of sit up a little straighter and get a little bit of pride in their chest, and they have that a little bit more of that connection. In many countries, they don't. They don't identify. They identify more with their in-group. And another dimension we looked at was called power distance, and that's where the unequal distribution of power is more accepted in a society. And most societies are higher on power distance, so that hierarchy. Some are much more so. So what we found was in-group collectivism, as we measured it, didn't really have a relationship with the propensity to participate in corporate social responsibility. Societal collectivism or institutional collectivism was more positively related to corporate social responsibility. So the more you identified at the societal level, the more likely you were to participate in corporate social responsibility, as we defined it. Power distance was negatively related. So the higher you have power distance in society, where you have more of a hierarchy, unequal distribution of a power, the less likely they are to be involved in corporate responsibility. And that's probably because they're going to look more at trying to hold on to power. And we have dimensions of this. So you can, going into a culture, if you're higher on power distance, you might find a propensity overall, in general, to have a more difficult time implementing corporate social responsibility types of endeavors. But if you're higher on societal collectivism, it might be a little bit easier. So I guess the takeaway is understanding what those societies are and what those dimensions are, and kind of actually getting at what you're saying, can give you an appreciation where your challenges might be.
And it may, Mary, if I could follow up, might it also prompt you to structure and position your CSR initiative differently? In other words, let's say you
Absolutely.
wanted to have something in all these countries,
Absolutely.
but you recognize that in certain cultural environments, certain triggers or signals are going to be more well received than in others.
Absolutely. And what it also begs the question is, how important is corporate culture?
Mm-hmm.
And corporate culture is key.
Yep.
But what you have to know is that if you need to understand what the societal culture is, how it operates, what you're going into, and understanding what that is, and knowing what your organizational culture is. If you create a very strong organizational culture and you reward for those behaviors that you want, but you got to keep at it. It's very important to understand what your organizational culture is. If it's different than the societal culture going into, make sure you're rewarding for the types of behaviors you want. You'll be able to create an organizational culture that may mitigate some of those differences at the societal level, but you have to understand that it might be a little bit counterculture to the culture in which you're operating.
Thank you. I have one more question for you, but I'm going to go to the audience first. I'll tell you the question. I'll come back to you later. I'd like you each to name, this gets back to Mark's challenge to us, name an individual that you consider to embody whatever you define as a responsible global leader. I'll give you a few minutes to think about it while we let the audience chime in and ask a question, make a comment, or some other kind of interjection. We've got about 10 minutes. Please. We could go, as you can see with Mary, we could go all afternoon here. Just kidding. I know Mary, I can say that to her. A question or comment, please. Chris.
Chris Robertson from Northeastern. With the Globe study, you mentioned charismatic leadership and how it relates to success as a leader. And you briefly mentioned integrity as, I guess, a sub-dimension of charismatic leadership.
Right.
With our conference theme being responsible global leadership, could you dive a little deeper into, but not too deep because of time limitations, but into the link between integrity and how you measured it and how that relates to success as a leader?
Right. The questions that we asked that pertain to integrity, we asked the top management team, if the way they were kind of behavioral questions of whether their CEO it demonstrated these indicators of integrity, and we found that was a very strong indicator, and it was so. As the top management team described their leader, and what we found, we actually looked at. This may be getting a little bit away from your question, but what we looked at is we call them the stars and the dogs, like the CEOs overall.
You're from BCG. That's going to sound familiar to you, I think.
the
Not cows, dogs, but that's okay.
Yeah, who were outstanding leaders in their companies, and the ones that were poor performing companies. And we found that integrity was one of the most important. It was in some of those same ones that vision, integrity, inspiration, performance-oriented, administratively competent. Those were big indicators of performance. And we didn't really know if we were going to find that with integrity. We didn't really know what we were going to find. And we had our hypotheses because we thought that what people identified in the second phase of the project, what they looked for in leaders, was going to predict performance. Some of the things they did, and that was one of them that actually did, and they were actually describing their CEOs.
Thank you. How about a question for maybe Terry or Nikos? Great.
I have a question for Nikos. Sorry. This story that you told us about BCCI, I thought that was really interesting in the way that your interpretation was different on a number of aspects and what was seen as being corruption but you phrased and told us examples of how it was about something else. And actually, a lot of it was about trying to do good and not just about avoiding harm. Now, I'm interested in your interpretation about the discrepancy between what you found and what was the maybe more official and harsh judgment of their acts. Is it so that there is a time perspective on this, so that over time we'll look upon certain behaviors in different ways, that doing good is not doing good for a longer set of time? Or is it maybe language issues? For example, a word that was seen as a positive word in the 70s was when managers or leaders influenced people. And of course, that became a very negative word only like 20 or 30 years later. So, what is your interpretation of this? Do we see changes in time in how we perceive behaviors? Or is it in the way that the stories are told? I mean, language issues? Or is it something else? I'm really curious to hear more about this. Thank you.
But not too much.
As I said, I studied this for 11 years, and I worked with prosecutors, congressional investigators, investors of BCCI, the owners, bankers, the CFO, and so on. There was nothing contextual about the reporting of BCCI, and the more money reporters received to write very successful books about it, the less truth I found in their accounts. So the more I read about BCCI, the less I recognized the case. I was able to see, BCCI had annual meetings, and branch managers would come together with the CEO and the top leadership. And I got the full transcripts of 2 days of meetings in Luxembourg, and the tapes. So I could see the tone, I could see if someone was joking or meaning something seriously. And I can tell you, it was a very different picture of what was intended and what was being done. Now, there is no doubt that crimes were committed, but what has been mixed in the same bag is crimes committed against the bank, crimes committed through the bank by the clients or others who had penetrated it, by individuals who worked at the bank but worked on their own, they were corrupt, and some of the misconduct that was committed by the bank. The false accounts that were created in order to keep the bank operational for years. It was a full-time business of a whole department in London that was using accounts in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and around the world to get around that. So there was absolute absence of the big picture in what was reported at the time. There were jewels included there. BCCI was successful actually in the third world, where it was riskier, where it was operating in countries that every other bank had fled. And they were profitable there. They were able to profit with integrity and social responsibility. Where they lost in the end was in the Grand Cayman and OECD parts of their operation. So we need a lot more time to get into that, but there were also the charismatic leader of BCCI was Sufi. There were elements that were misunderstood. So there was the linguistic and there was the Islamic. I mean, he was a Muslim, devout Muslim, and he was coming from Pakistan. And, you know, in London, he wasn't from Eton and he wasn't from Cambridge and he wasn't from Oxford or Edinburgh, where I did my PhD for that matter. So he came from Pakistan. And the owner was Abu Dhabi, you know. And then you look who went to prison for the things that did go wrong at the bank. It was some Pakistanis who went there, but Clark Clifford and Bob Altman and the others who were the key actors in the United States, one's charges were dropped, the other one was acquitted. It was the Federal Reserve that went successfully after Altman for what he did. But when he was acquitted, Diane Sawyer had a special on ABC with a party that Wonder Woman, his wife, and Bob Altman were celebrating their victory. And I can tell you, before 9/11, I was writing a book on why that was miscarriage of justice. They were guilty as sin, and I have the records. But then 9/11 happened in my priorities. I lost track of my priorities there.
But one more question before we come back for their responses to my final question. Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Terry, your description of what what's been going on at Fidelity I found interesting. And while you were describing that, I was thinking about the distinction that Gunter had made in his definition of responsible global leadership between do no harm and doing good. And when he was laying that out, it seemed like a stark distinction. But as I listened to you, I heard a lot about do no harm, and I didn't hear much about doing good. And that's not to suggest that Fidelity's not doing good, but I wondered if there's any blending or integration of those two, or if within Fidelity there's a sense that those two approaches or those two perspectives are fairly cleanly separated.
I'd say today, Alan, they probably are more separated than they need to be or should be. And again, foundationally, our culture is one of compliance. I think as we go forward, the true dark side of a compliance mentality is it merely accomplishes compliance transactions, and it doesn't anticipate the opportunity to apply judgment and leadership to other type of areas. There's certainly do good activity in Fidelity. I don't think that organizationally or by policy they are as aligned as I said they should be, and that's one of the things that we think about, whether or not an ethics and compliance program is the joint program is the immediate next step to try to have people thinking in that, so that you change some short-term behavior and also generate ideas and opportunities for some longer-term change.
Okay, my final question. Nikos, a responsible global leader.
Well,
I know it's a
I would
tough
like
question.
to give. I would like to give actually two types of responses from corporations. One is by necessity in response to being detected for doing things wrongly, and that is Siemens. They're doing this well, and they show how you can operate very well, profitably, proudly, with integrity throughout the world. So it's a good example of how integrity actually pays. An example of proactive implementation of similar sort of standards is Hewlett-Packard, where they will have, and that is a challenge that both companies are marrying the global compliance program that you've got to have with the local specificities. So you have with Hewlett-Packard an example of a company that has the general principles that are there, and then addenda that accompany regions where people will have to adapt to what is happening in special countries. I think that is the key challenge. How do you marry the legitimate with the legal? What is allowed and what is right?
Thank you. Mary.
Well, because I do lots of interviews, I've interviewed lots of leaders, and many of you you've never heard of that I think are really outstanding. But the one leader that comes to mind that I think is very good is Indira Nori at PepsiCo. She does an excellent job. But two people there's a Peruvian by the name of Genaro Matute who restructured the comptroller's office in Peru and made it. And some of the things that I think are outstanding in leadership is that transparent. He was a very good communicator of high integrity and had a very strong vision about how he wanted to restructure. And he completely digitized the comptroller's office, which made it changed the country. And I know Chris knows exactly who I'm talking about, and what it really did change the course of that country. And in this millennium, it has really helped set that country in a completely different path. Because once you provide that transparency, especially in a comptroller's office at the national level, you can't go back.
Thank you. Terry.
Reactively, the leadership team of Johnson & Johnson in the wake of the Tylenol recall, they made a tough call in terms of trade-offs financially and the override of operational and quality control procedures. They had a plan that was well communicated and understood, and they assured the availability of resources to carry it out.
Right. Thank you. That's one that I think we all know well, but it's good to hear that we're on the right track. Please join me in thanking Mary, Terry, and Nikos for a very engaging and inspiring discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you. Who's next? Who's next?
We will take
Gary, that was excellent. I couldn't have asked for more. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. No, I really appreciate it. It was just what I was hoping for and more.
Should have that information in your package. If you don't, if you would please see Ann, clarify that for you. And we will see you again. They have better on the site.